Feuding choirs, ancient Rome goes to space, a wedding to remember. All this and more on today's episode.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, today I have a fantastic interview. But first, if you would like to support the podcast and support my work, you can do so by checking out some of my resource books that I create. I create the Books of Random Tables. They can be found simply by searching the Book of Random Tables in Google. They can be found at DiceGeeks.com. They can also be found on DriveThruRPG.com and Amazon.com. They help game masters cut down their prep time and have more fun at the table. All right, enough of all that. Here's today's interview. My guest today is the award-winning game designer and writer behind the Molten Sulfur blog, Tristan Zimmerman. Tristan, welcome back to the show, man.
Matt, always a delight to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It is so much fun to talk to you about history and literature and folklore and all that stuff and how to use it in our campaigns. So let's just jump right in, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, our first topic, I should say we're going to talk about outer space adventures in Rome and a wedding to remember. But first, we're going to tackle Boomtown choirs. Now, you're going to have to help us on this one, Tristan. How are you going to use this in role-playing games?
So this little bit comes out of the Australian Gold Rush, which begins 1851. And the Australian Gold Rush is kind of a Wild West setting, if you want to, Americanize it, I guess. Mm-hmm. With, huge rushes of men leaving Britain to race to Australia to try to win their fortune, living in rough and ready boom towns, sleeping with a loaded pistol under your pillow in case somebody tries to jump your claim or steal your gold, right? And so it's this very rough, wild setting. The area we're talking about is the neighboring towns of Ballarat and Sebastopol in Victoria. In this area, which actually in the Gold Rush period winds up being this really important area for Australian history. Some folks in the audience may have heard of the Eureka Rebellion that occurs not far from here, and the two Aboriginal nations that historically live here have been mostly hamstrung by the British Army at this point. So they unfortunately are not players in this story. Like I said, Wild West, right? There's definitely some parallels to be drawn. But what's going on in this area is you have gold, and the gold is buried, but it's quite close to the surface. Which means that for at least the first part of the Australian Gold Rush, you don't need, giant machines and big companies and whatever. Like, dude with shovel and pickaxe can hold on to a crazy dream that he's going to strike it rich and then go back home to England. And something that's kind of unique about Ballarat and Sebastopol is they have a sizable minority of Welshmen in the diggings around Ballarat and Sebastopol. Welshmen, of course, are no strangers to the Australian Gold Rush. There's Welshmen all over Australia in this point, but generally they're very spread out. And Ballarat and Sebastopol are unusual in that they have a high concentration of folks from Wales, mostly men. At least half of them from the same town back in Wales, Glamorgan, coal mining country. So of course these are men comfortable and familiar with mining. And as a consequence of this density, you have Welsh cultural institutions in Ballarat and Sebastopol. You have Welsh language newspapers. You have Welsh language churches. You have this really cool Welsh bardic competition that happens most years called the Eisteddfod. And the Eisteddfod starts out in the 1850s as being exclusively conducted in the Welsh language, where people compete for singing and reciting and choral singing, and but by the 1870s, the Welsh language component has been discarded. In fact, by that point, all the gold that's close to the surface has been mined out. It's all big companies at that point, and most of the Welshmen who maintained these cultural institutions have moved on to other parts of Australia. But everybody who stayed, whether Welsh or English or Scottish or Irish or whatever, they've gotten really into this Eisteddfod. It's like this really cool local phenomenon. And so even though it's now conducted exclusively in English, it's still persisting. And in the Welsh language or mixed language era of this Eisteddfod, there are two kind of major players in the competition, two major choruses who have this big rivalry. And these two choruses are the Sebastopol Welsh Choir, also called the Gomer Choir, and the Cambrian Vocal Union. And in fact, their rivalry was such a big deal that when it was announced that they would be competing against one another at the 1865 Ballarat Eisteddfod, so many people turned out to watch that it was the best attended Eisteddfod in memory in Ballarat. So like, this bardic competition is a really big deal. The choral component of it was a really big deal. And these two choirs were really big deals. And so you got tensions running high, and, different groups competing for the same thing, right? These are critical components to a fun adventure. So, briefly, you can't have two identical groups competing because that's not interesting. They've got to be asymmetric. So what makes the Gomer Choir different from the Cambrian Vocal Union? Well, the Gomer Choir takes its name from the fact that it is a religious choir. It's a religious organization. Gomer is a biblical figure whom some people claim, without any biblical evidence, that the Welsh are supposedly descended from this biblical figure named Gomer. So the Gomer Choir is a religious choir. It is non-denominational, and that is interesting and important in this era. The Welsh community in Ballarat and Sebastopol, as is typical with like human identity, prided itself on a number of things where if you really dig down into it, there's not actually a statistically significant difference between the Welsh community and their neighbors. But, hey, welcome to human identity. And one of those things was that, Welshmen are supposed to be Protestant nonconformists. That is to say, they're supposed to be Protestants who are not Anglicans. And of course, about half of the church-going Welshmen in Ballarat were in fact Anglicans anyway. And there was no agreement in the Welsh community, including within the newspapers, on like, what sort of Protestant are you supposed to be? Are you supposed to be a Methodist? Are you supposed to be a Baptist? Like, we're all nonconformists, but that coat buttons up over a great many different identities. So all of which is to say that the so-called denominational devil was a big deal in the Welsh community, in these two rough and ready gold rush boomtowns, with people disliking one another and kind of verbally sniping at one another over not being the right kind of religious Welshmen. So the Gomer Choir is non-denominational, which means that it probably has Anglicans and nonconformists of multiple different kinds, and I'm sure that created kind of some internal dissension within the Gomer Choir, not least in 1869 when they performed a charity concert to raise money for a Calvinistic Methodist chapel in Sebastopol, right? Like, okay, well, why is it going to the Methodists? Why isn't it going to this other church? So that's, and given the era, I wasn't able to find any evidence on this one way or another, but given the era and the cultural milieu, it is entirely possible that the Gomer Choir was at least nominally teetotaling, right? Was at least nominally against the consumption of alcohol. The Cambrian Vocal Union, by contrast, was composed entirely of gold miners. So we can imagine, if we want to imagine the Gomers as being, kind of teetotaling religious types, the Cambrian Vocal Union guys are rough and ready gold miners, with weather-beaten faces and pistols tucked into the backs of their pants, and so you get a nice contrast going there. The Gomer, so both of these groups would perform serious works and funny works, but the Gomers also would perform fancy works like those by Mendelssohn and Rossini. So you've got these two competing groups. Now is as good a time as any to mention that at least for the first few years, the Eisteddfod was viewed with some suspicion by local authorities, who feared that this might be an attempt by those seditious Welshmen to introduce sectarian divides in the good community of Ballarat, and turn neighbor against neighbor by standing up for Welsh heritage. Of course, that was utterly baseless, but again, welcome to human identity. So if we're going to do a fictional version of this, for the campaign you're already running, I think that it works best in something like its original context, right? Someplace rough and ready and frontier-ish. Fortunately, RPGs have no shortage of rough and ready frontier-ish stuff. Western games like Deadlands or I can't believe I'm blanking on the name.
Aces and Eights.
Yeah. Are an obvious example, but really anything in the Dungeons and Dragons vein is fundamentally a game about frontier nonsense. So drops right in there without any problems. Mm-hmm. You've got some sort of big cultural event with a competitive nature, because of the strong strain of the bardic tradition through Welsh cultural history. It's a singing competition here in real life, but in your fictional setting, if singing isn't a big deal, cool, man, like make it handball or fish kissing or whatever's a big deal for your fictional people. If you do wind up going with singing, though, offer a bonus if any of your players wind up saying like, yes, my character will compete in the Eisteddfod. Offer bonus points on rolls if the player is willing to perform in character at the table. I once had a player where I had something similar to that going on. I said like, hey, if you're willing to sing it, like your character's singing, if you're willing to sing it for realsies, like bonus points on the roll. And by God, she showed up to the next session with a recording. And she sure did really well on that roll as a consequence. It was super fun. So you've got maybe the PCs want to compete. Maybe because there's a cash prize. Yeah. Maybe the PCs don't necessarily want to complete, but both choirs have announced what they're going to do with the money. And maybe one of the choirs has announced that it's going to do something with the money that the PCs either really want to happen or really want to not happen. In which case the PCs are going to want to try to to sway what's going on. Maybe they have to rig the competition by bribing or blackmailing the judges, or catch somebody from the opposing side doing the same thing. If you want to, you can bring in the bit about the authorities really aren't sure about this, and like maybe the PCs, their goal isn't like, oh, we got to sway the competition, but rather like the competition is really cool. We can't allow the man to shut down, the cool cultural event. Like, get out of here, the man. And so they got to stymie the authorities, maybe by doing favors for other authorities who can countermand the shutdown, or just by spreading chaos, right? Like, if there's one thing players in RPGs are good at, it's spreading chaos.
Yes.
That
is true. Yes.
That's kind of two competing goldmine Boomtown choirs in your role-playing game, and how you can make an adventure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it when I read about it on your blog, I thought it was very interesting, not least of which because it happens coincidentally that right now I am running. Well, it was supposed to be a one shot, but it's turned into like 5 sessions as one shots usually do. But I am running, I forced a few of my players to make bards, and we're doing a big bard music festival that happens at Baldur's Gate every, I think I said it was like every 8 years that I made up. And they are competing in this festival. And of course, there are all kinds of shenanigans and illegal dealings happening in the background. And so I thought this was interesting when I read this on your blog. It's just an interesting way to kind of put some of these things in there, because I think one thing about this is that I hardly imagine, I don't think when I've read about the gold rush, even here in the, in America's West, or heard stories even a little bit about the Australian gold mine, the gold rush and that, I don't really ever think I imagine gold miners forming a choir and singing, right?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a thing that it's easy. I feel like music in the era where we live in is so different from what it was before anybody could just pop in a recording, right? Like, I have Spotify, and like I could listen to any music anywhere at any time. And when my great grandmother was growing up, before radio, the only way she could listen to music is if somebody was performing music in front of her, like a real human person. And we're humans. We love music. Music is great. And so, we're always making music. We're always providing it. And if there's no recording, then, by God, we're going to get together and we're going to make some music, even if we're in a setting where, maybe Fred and I, we make beautiful music together, but then we go back to the diggings. And if he comes into my tent, I'm going to shoot him dead because he's here to steal my gold. And actually, if I can do a total tangent, just because you mentioned your one shot turning into a 5-shot, it's a gaming story, Aghast, that I'm particularly proud of. A buddy of mine ran what was supposed to be a one shot set in the late 19th century, where we all were playing, different people involved in occult or bohemian spheres, and we were investigating a murder, right? Solve the murder mystery. And my character was a guy by the name of Rudolf Steiner, who was a real historical figure, heavily involved in a bunch of spiritualist, occult, and religious movements in the late 19th century. And I decided that I was going to play Rudolf Steiner as a guy who knew that he was a fraud, right? The real Rudolf Steiner wrote all this stuff about like magic. Fundamentally, he wouldn't have called it magic, but fundamentally magic. And I wanted to play Rudolf Steiner, who was an intentional con man, right? He was a scam artist. And so we get to the crime scene. We're investigating the crime. And I announce that I am going to tell everyone that, like, oh, the spirits are speaking to me. They're telling me the details. Of course, the spirits aren't speaking to me. They're not telling me anything. I'm just making up details about the crime scene. And the rest of the party's like, oh, come on, Tristan. And the GM says, all right, make your rolls. Like, there's a lot of you. One of you will see through his lies. Everybody fails their rolls. So they say, okay, well, I guess we believe whatever he tells us. And I start announcing that, like, the killer came from Moscow. The spirits are telling me that we need to go to Moscow. So all the party dutifully gets on board a train and rides off to Moscow. And the GM is just like, I never intended for you to leave Vienna. You have just completely taken my one shot off the rails. And then a few days later, I got on a warship and deployed to the Middle East. I knew this was going to happen and I wouldn't be back for a year. And so I created this giant mess and said, good luck, guys, figure it out. And departed. And that one shot turned into an almost year-long campaign.
Oh, my gosh.
As they had to undo the damage that Rudolf Steiner did simply because I decided to be a jerk. It was enormous fun. I'm deeply proud of it.
Oh, great. Okay. So Tristan just gave all listeners out there permission to be jerks. That's fantastic.
Yes.
Well, I did think your point, though, about entertainment, especially back in kind of the gold rush era or the 1800s or, in different settings like that, or especially like a D&D kind of fantasy setting, is that you had to make your own entertainment, right? If there's no show being put on somewhere and you're at your campsite at night or whatever, you're like, well, so-and-so you play the fiddle and so-and-so you sing and different things like that. So I find that really interesting. That I think that is something we don't think about sometimes, because like you said, like I can open Spotify and play music from like almost any time period I want. Right. And so I think that is interesting. And it kind of does raise a question. So what if you're playing in, a sci-fi campaign? What if somebody's running like a modern or a sci-fi campaign where choirs just aren't just springing up in gold mining camps? Or do we lean into that frontier aspect? Like it's a rough and frontier town and we don't have a lot of stuff out here, so we still have to make our own music and stuff like that.
So that's certainly the avenue that Firefly took, right? And you'll never hear me say a bad word about Firefly. Phenomenal show, phenomenal setting. But if music or singing more specifically doesn't work for your setting, just choose a different cultural artifact. We as humans, we're always going to be doing something creative, competitive, aesthetic, or even athletic, right? Like just pick something that really matters to people in your setting. I promise you there is something that people in your setting come together and compete about. Just use that.
Nice. Okay. So I'm now ready to run my I don't know, Star Trek Olympics campaign or something like that, right, Tristan?
Yeah, that would be phenomenally fun. Like everybody gets together in the holodeck, and here's Worf, and he's very uncomfortable in spandex, but that's the uniform for the Olympics. And...
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So no, that's really cool. All right. Well, our next topic, this one doesn't sound absolutely historical, but I'm really fascinated. I'm sure listeners are as well. How do we get outer space adventures in Rome?
Well, Matt, how can you say it's not historical? The source I'm pulling it from says a true history right on the front.
It says right there, it's named a true history. So absolutely
true history. Yeah. Like that's all you need.
Yeah.
So Lucian of Samosata was a 2nd century author writing in what is today Turkey and was at the time part of the Roman Empire. He was in a culturally Greek part of the Roman Empire, but, I assume a Roman citizen. Occurs to me that I'm just saying that off the cuff, but, whatever. Anyway, he's Roman and he's culturally Greek. And he had a bone to pick with a certain type of classical historian or author of travelogues who would just include the most ludicrous claims about what people get up to in far distant lands that either they just made up because they thought it would be interesting, or that, somebody told them and they dutifully recorded that, well, I met a guy who said that in Babylon, this is what goes on. And of course, it's all very silly. And the relevant author who's best known in the modern day is Herodotus.
Yeah.
That chafes me a little bit. I love Herodotus. I think Herodotus is fabulous. I will never say a mean thing about him. But it cannot be denied that Herodotus includes a lot of details about let me tell you, in Bactria, there are these giant furry ants that mine gold from the ground. It's like... Do that? Are there though, Herodotus? Did you see them?
Did you go there? Go there?
And the answer is Herodotus very generously tells us, no, I went to Babylon and I heard this from the priests in Babylon. It's okay, well, you cited your sources, buddy. Yep. And you're also literally the first person to ever do this. So, you're not going to be perfect.
Yeah. And I love Herodotus too, how he includes some of the stories about the ants. And then isn't there one about a dolphin, a guy riding a dolphin or something? For There's one about a dude who got saved by a dolphin and carried him all the way back to shore or whatever. And then, whatever, we still tell stories like that. Yeah, absolutely. And then, but he at one point makes a very good point to say he thinks it's too fantastical that you could sail a ship around Africa. And you're just why? Why is that too fantastical? You got giant ants and other stuff. Why is that fantastical? I find that one funny.
So Lucian of Samosata, he sets out to write a book that's going to satirize this sort of author, and he calls it A True History. And he goes ahead and he tells us right at the beginning that actually none of this is true. But by golly, this is the only part where I'm going to tell you it's not true. And he includes all this, wonderful travelogue stuff in it. But the really relevant part for us today is his adventures in outer space. And so he recounts how he goes to sea with a ship with 50 Greek companions of his, and they get caught up in a whirlwind. And, this tornado sucks them out of the ocean and drops them on the moon. And they're on the moon, and it's wow, the moon is a lot like the Earth. It's cultivated. There's farmers' fields. There's towns. Admittedly, the air is full of flying frogs, and the people look super duper weird. And at night, when you look up into the sky, you can see the Earth kind of fills the sky above you. And you can see all, the mountains and the rivers and the whatever. But also you can see other islands in the sky, much like the moon is an island in the sky. And these are the other planets. And Lucian and his buddies are immediately rolled up by the people of the moon, a people he calls the Hippogippians. And they look just like people, except that they are mostly hairless, except that they have beards on their knees. And they wear robes made of glass if you're rich, and if you're poor, you wear robes made of bronze. And they ride giant vultures instead of horses. And there's just a whole bunch of really fun stuff about the Hippogippians. The Hippogippians take Lucian and his buddies to their king, a man named Endymion, who it turns out is also Greek. How did Endymion get to the moon? He fell asleep on the earth and woke up and he was on the moon, and that's how he got there. And the Hippogippians said, wow, this guy's super cool. Let's make him our king. And so he's their king. And he's really glad to see his men from his country, not least because he could really use some reinforcements. You see, the moon is about to go to war with the sun. And hey, buddies, would you mind fighting in our war against the sun people? Absolutely, we'd be happy to. You seem like a cool dude, Endymion. So the reason why the people of the sun and the people of the moon are fighting is the Hippogippians sent a whole bunch of people from the moon to the morning star. Now, I think it's very interesting that that Lucian uses the phrase "the morning star," because by this point, educated people in the Roman Empire understand that there is no morning star and evening star. They are the same celestial body. They are the planet Venus, right? They're the same planet. But the concept of the morning star is sticky, right? It endures in religious contexts, and it endures in linguistic contexts, right? Because, if I go to another aquarium and encounter another sign helpfully telling me that that starfish aren't actually fish, like, my dude, I know they're not fish. Like, they're just called starfish. And I'm sure that if I brought this up with Lucian, he'd be like, my dude, I know it's not the morning star. Like, that doesn't mean we have to change the word. What's wrong with you? And like, yeah fair. So anyway, they send a team. The Moon people have sent a team to the Morning Star to found a colony, and this was a pretty common thing in the classical Greek world, where when your city starts to fill up with people, and you start to say, pretty full over here, you can organize people and send them out to found a new city, and that new city is not. We use the word colony because it's similar to, like, 19th century European colonies, but really it's kind of its own thing. You send them out, and they found a new city. You send scouts out ahead of time to figure out where there's a good spot for a city where nobody has a city right now. And that city then the new city is not subordinate to the old city. It's not like, here we are on the outer outpost of the lands controlled by the old city. Like, no, we're self-governing. We're our own thing. But they will probably maintain cultural ties with the old city, not unlike how the United States has maintained cultural ties with the UK. And so, okay, they were going to found a colony on Venus. But the colonists were about halfway to Venus when they were attacked by people from the sun.
Oh no! And
they had to retreat in disarray. And now it's clear that the sun and the moon are going to go to war over Venus. So the moon people send out to get to Venus and to make a battlefield, a space on which the battle will occur. They send out these giant spiders that spin a web between the moon and Venus. And they're so big that they spin the web in an instant. And now you can just walk. You can walk from the moon to Venus, easy as pie. But the sun people come out, and the sun people aren't going to let this go unchallenged. So the sun people come out, and you get these really wonderful descriptions of the armies of the sun and the moon. So the moon people, it isn't just the moon people. You've also got their allies from across the universe. So you've got the Hippogippians. They are mounted on their giant vultures. Some of them instead are mounted on giant chickens with wart leaves instead of body feathers, and lettuce leaves instead of wing feathers. You've got allies coming who ride fleas the size of a dozen elephants. You've got dudes who fight on foot, but they wear these long capes that they can use to fly, right? They use the capes kind of as sails, and that lets them fly. And then but what about the armies of the sun? Oh no, there's 50,000 hippomyrmex who are the inhabitants of the sun. The hippomyrmex are huge, winged, horned ants. The biggest of these ants is 2 acres in size. Also, the translation I was using was Victorian, and it's not perfect, and it might actually be that the hippomyrmex ride on these ants. The translation was a little ambiguous. But the hippomyrmex also have allies. You've got archers mounted on giant gnats. You've got these dudes who have slings, but they don't cast sling stones from their slings. They cast poisonous turnips. And anybody who's hit by one of these poison turnips develops a wound that is so smelly that he dies from the smell. Let's see here. There's dudes with mushroom shields and asparagus spears. And then from the dog star Sirius, you've got men with the faces of dogs who ride on winged acorns. And there is a battle, and there's so much bloodshed, and the blood rains down upon the earth, and Lucian is convinced that all the earth will be washed away by how much blood there is raining down. But ultimately, the moon men are victorious, and the sun men retreat. And then the last allies of the sun men show up. Nephilo centaurs. And these creatures from the waist up, they are men the size of the Colossus of Rhodes. And from the waist down, they are winged horses as big as a cargo ship. And with them is their leader, the constellation Sagittarius. And Sagittarius leads his Nephilo centaurs, and they fall upon the army of the moon and rally the army of the sun. And the moon people are defeated, and they flee back to their moon city, back on the moon. And things are looking grim for the moon people. Now, you might expect that the sun people would besiege the moon city, but that honestly seemed like a lot of work. So instead, the sun army creates an eclipse. They generate a double wall of clouds between the sun and the moon in order to keep the moon in eternal night. And that was so awful, apparently, that King Endymion is forced to agree to a peace treaty. The peace treaty is actually pretty standard for a classical peace treaty. It is remarkably not weird. The moon, as the loser, will provide money and hostages to the sun. And in exchange, both parties agree that they will be friends now. And if one of them is attacked, the other will come to their aid. And they'll work together to found a colony on the Morning Star. So, they're brothers and best buddies now, except one of them has to send money and hostages every year. Lucian, then he and his companions, they stay on the moon for a long time. He writes in great detail about the peculiar habits of the moon people. Ultimately, so I dropped this blog post on the day that the new 5th edition D&D Spelljammer books released. Mm-hmm. It felt relevant.
It did. Good call.
And so I think that this presents just a really cool kind of template for fantasy adventures in space in the, following the Spelljammer model. Yeah. And the honestly, for all that, we've got all these really cool aliens and, weirdness. For me, the most gameable and useful part is actually how these dudes got to the moon. Mm-hmm. Because one of my favorite D&D settings is Dragonlance. And if you want to get to one of the moons in Dragonlance, the traditional, in scare quotes, way to do it is you encounter some Tinker Gnomes, and the Tinker Gnomes are like, we made a dirigible. And you get on the dirigible, and then it works too well, and you wind up on the moon, and it's a big accident. But boy, that's a lot of contrivance in order to get your party to the moon adventure you had prepped. Whereas Lucian just presents us with two fabulous options. Option the first, yeah, man, you're just walking down the street and there's a tornado. And the tornado spits you out on the moon. No, you can't roll to not get in the tornado. It's a tornado. It sucked you up. And then the other is even more arbitrary, which is just you went to sleep and you woke up on the moon. What, you got a problem with that?
Yeah.
Sometimes people wake up on the moon. It's a thing. Check your books.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is really good. And I think, like you were saying, for Spelljammer, it works. And also, I've just released a book that is a book of random tables, fantasy space, and I include 100 different ways you can get your regular fantasy characters into space, because I think that is a fun way to kind of carry on some continuity with existing characters, but bring them into a new setting like Spelljammer. And I do think, because now that, you mentioned that Spelljammer has dropped, and I've been seeing a lot of YouTube videos, a lot of chatter about Spelljammer. And I think there is a certain group of people who are thinking very scientifically or science fictionally, kind of like Spelljammer. And you're like, no, no, the people live on the moon. People live in the sun. Like, yeah, like this is not science fiction, D&D and science fiction. This is fantasy. This is a space fantasy, right? So yes, you're going to have a giant vulture or a giant winged ant. That's the way it goes, right? And gravity and breathing stuff, those aren't things, right? Like, who wants to worry about that? Yeah. Who wants to worry about that, right?
Yeah. You're dead on. And I think that Lucian really offers us a really wonderful window into how someone before the era of telescopes and before the scientific revolution would have thought about space. And I'm not saying that Lucian is accurately recounting what the wisest scholars of his era thought was the moon. Like, he is not. Mm-hmm. But the way that he is thinking about it cannot help but bleed through in his portrayal. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really helpful when we are presenting fantasy campaigns. It provides us a way to kind of step outside of our own heads and think about things from a fresh perspective that then enables us to turn around and deliver really fresh and fun and unique adventures for our players.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I guess it kind of even goes along what we were saying before. And the other one, sometimes we get stuck so much in our own time period, so much in our own knowledge that we pass that on into a game that has a totally different world. Right. And we need to think you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it is, you're playing this fantasy game and you're like, oh, the sun is up in the sky. Well, the sun doesn't have to be a big ball somewhere. The sun is like a lady who drives a chariot of fiery horses and lands on an island in the middle of the ocean every night when it goes down, right? Like, we kind of put our cosmology onto this fantasy world, and I think that's a big mistake.
Yeah, I agree. I think that our adventures are richer when we try to think about them kind of in universe setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of also works too. Obviously, it works great in a Dungeons and Dragons Spelljammer. It would work. It gives some great ideas. I mean, when I run Spelljammer, I mean, a winged giant ant is probably going to be in there somewhere or whatever it was. I'm going to use something like that. So that works really well. I think also it could work really well in kind of a Lovecraftian kind of the 1920s and 1930s, because you could almost say that like Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing his Martian books and his books about Venus and stuff. He writes about those things almost in the same way, right? You go there and there are four-armed creatures and blah, and all of this stuff. So I think it works pretty well in that, kind of setting as well. I think I don't know about your opinion on that, but I think the biggest disconnect would be then a modern game that's set in, the 21st century encountering something like this, or a science fiction game. It seems to be kind of at odds with the kind of the space fantasy kind of realm. I don't know what your opinions are on those things about it.
I would agree with you. I would not use anything from Lucian in a 21st century game. I think that I think you made a fabulous point with Edgar Rice Burroughs, but I would not push the timeline any further to the right than Burroughs. And even in Burroughs, you already see the popular imagining of what space looks like starting to shift to something we would recognize as a more scientific perspective, because of course the hero John Carter is Superman on Mars, and why is he Superman? Because Mars has low gravity, which of course means that he is super strong and he can jump everywhere, and he's good at stabbing now. And obviously that's very silly, but Burroughs does try to frame it in terms of kind of scientific forces.
Yeah, dried oceans and like canals that had been filled with water because that was prevailing at the time. So so he's mixing it with some of the science of the time, but then also the fantasy of being able to go there and being able to breathe and not incinerated by radiation or whatever would happen to a person who went there for real. So I think that's I think that could work, but I think you push it. I think that could be why sometimes some of the kind of revivals of Burroughs even struggle today, like in movie theaters and things like that, is because we're like so set in our cosmology. It's just like, we need something a little bit more, Matt Damon can go to Mars and not get burned to death by radiation, but because we put them in, a suit and different things like that in The Martian or whatever. But trying to say that they're four-armed creatures on Mars and that you become Superman doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. But so I think this has a lot of potential in Spelljammer, has a lot of potential, even if you're running like a Call of Cthulhu or an Edgar Rice Burroughs game, or if you're running the some of the John Carter games that are out there. This should give you some ideas that flying acorn is totally legit in Edgar Rice Burroughs. I mean, that's like legit. All right. Well, we have another topic we can conclude, and we can kind of wrap up here with a wedding to remember. How do we make weddings interesting, Tristan?
So this particular bit is about the writings of the 12th century Anglo-French author Marie de France. And ordinarily, of course, we try to do mostly history on the podcast, but I like to pull from literature and folklore. And just by coincidence, this episode, we've got two literature topics that we're talking about. So Marie de France was writing in the 12th century, and she wrote in a genre called the lay. And lays are kind of halfway between poems of courtly love and long-form chivalric romance / adventure stories. So a lay is shorter. It's kind of short story in length, and it usually deals with one incident or a limited range of incidents in the lives of its protagonists or its singular protagonist. And this incident usually involves some combination of love and adventure. It's a very particular kind of genre, but it's a lot of fun. So I kind of pulled out three lays from Marie de France that work really well in an RPG setting. So the first one here is about a wedding, and the story is called Le Fraisne, and it's at first it's a story about slander, right? So you've got this noblewoman, and she hears through the grapevine that a neighboring noblewoman has given birth to twins, and she sees the opportunity to slander her neighbor, and she says, "Oh, twins, huh? It has never come to pass that a woman has given birth to twins, except that there were two fathers. So clearly my neighbor is adulterous." And, obviously that's a terrible thing to say and also untrue. And, Marie certainly recognized that this is terrible and untrue. So, of course, what comes to pass shortly thereafter, but this noblewoman herself gives birth to twins. And, she is very ashamed. She has to hide her shame. Of course, she's not adulterous or anything. It just reveals that she's a big old hypocrite.
Yeah.
And so what she does is she takes one of her twin daughters, who's still just a little bitty infant, and smuggles her away to a convent, and leaves the child there as a foundling, and as evidence of the child's noble birth, leaves the baby with a really beautiful piece of cloth and a nice ring. And the child grows up. Of course, she grows up to be beautiful because, that's kind of how these stories go. And everybody calls her Le Fresne. And there's a lord named Gurun who sees her and he falls in love with her. And she loves him too. And they, she leaves the convent. She lives with him in his castle. But they don't get married. And they can't get married. They're having a lot of sex. Can I say that on this podcast?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're having a lot of sex, but they're not married because Gurun is a nobleman. He can really only marry for political reasons, right? But concubinage is, I hesitate to say okay, but like an accepted reality of life. But all of, and they live together very happily for many years. Meanwhile, Gurun's vassals are pressuring him. Gurun, my lord, you have to get married. You haven't had any kids with Le Fresne, but even if you did, they would not be legitimate. They would not be able to inherit. You need heirs. If you don't have heirs when you die, it's all going to fall apart. We're all going to have to go to war with each other, and none of us want that. Get thee a wife, my lord. So he manages to put this off for a long time, but they're getting rebellious. And so he says, okay, I have to marry. My vassals have picked out this beautiful damsel named La Coudre. And, she's heir to much land. She's lovely. Couldn't have asked for a better marriage. But Gurun and Le Fresne recognize that La Coudre isn't going to want Le Fresne around, right? Like that's not how people work. It would be unrealistic to expect that La Coudre is going to be unexpectedly, without any warning, into polyamory. So Le Fresne has to go. Unknown to anybody, Le Fresne and La Coudre are twin sisters, because of course they are. La Coudre is the daughter the mother kept. And at the wedding, their mother is there overseeing events. She's the mother-in-law. She's the mother of the bride. She's overseeing events. And here's Le Fresne, who is helping out with everything without complaint, even though her heart is irreparably broken. And to demonstrate her respect for Gurun and for his new marriage, Le Fresne takes out the beautiful cloth that she that was left with her when she was an infant and spreads it out on the bed. And when the mother is inspecting the bridal suite to make sure everything, the marriage suite to make sure everything's copacetic, she sees the cloth and immediately recognizes it. Right. This is the cloth that I left with my abandoned daughter. Tracks down who laid the cloth on the bed, asks Le Fresne, hey, was there a ring to go with that? And in so doing proves to Le Fresne that the mother actually does have inside information about all this. All is revealed. They embrace. They are mother and daughter. They are reunited at last. The priest undoes the marriage. The marriage is not yet consummated. Scratch that, rewind. Let's actually marry Le Fresne, the former concubine, to Gurun. We'll get a different husband for La Coudre. It's fine. She's beautiful. She's wealthy, and she turns out to be perfectly okay. And ultimately the mother just kind of has to live with her shame, right? Has to live with the shame of being outed as a terrible hypocrite who abandoned one of her children rather than be outed as a hypocrite. I suspect we don't necessarily have time to get into kind of some other stories from Marie de France, but what's really, I just think it's a really fun story, right? And it's a great example of ways that you can complicate a wedding in order to make it adventure worthy, right? And I'm not saying like, weddings, that thing that we have all the time in our role-playing game adventures. Here's how to make them more fun. But rather, like, weddings are a thing that people do, right? Across the world, across history. Like, we like weddings. And so it's perfectly reasonable that your characters would be invited to weddings, that they would attend weddings. And here's a way to make that fun and adventure worthy is that there's a right that there's the mother of the bride is snooping around, right? That she is snooping around. She clearly knows more than she's letting on. This is very weird. Like, might there be some funny business going on? In your fictional setting, the mother of the bride does not want to reveal that she is a big old hypocrite, right? So she knows what's going on, but she's not going to tell anybody, right? She would rather her own child suffer permanent heartbreak than be revealed as the hypocrite that she is. So what do you do? Right? Do you do some snooping yourself? Do you figure out what's going on? How do you handle this situation? In the blog post I wrote about this, I also presented 2 other lays from Marie de France, and then showed how you can kind of weave all 3 of them together, and different you can make a single NPC do double duty, right? She's the mother of this character, but she's also the wife of this other character, and in so doing you've kind of mushed these 2 stories together, and you can create kind of a really complicated wedding with a bunch of different moving pieces. And I'm a big fan of complicated stories with a bunch of different moving pieces at the gaming table, not least because they are not super duper hard to prepare. Really, what you do is you just prepare 3 relatively simple plots, and let's call a spade here. Le Fresne is not a complicated plot. You just prepare 3 very simple plots, explain how they all mash together and how they all kind of can ping pong ball off one another, and events in one can impact events in the other. Drop the players at the table, and events begin happening. And then, and this is super fun, you can just drop plots as needed, right? Literally on the Tuesday before we recorded this, I ran a session that had, multiple wheels going on. And you know what? The players, they saw one of those wheels and they said, "Oh my God, we want in." The wheel was that there's probably something hidden in secret caves under this manor. And they were like, "Secret caves under the manor? All in, forget the rest of it. We are so sold on secret caves under the manor. Let's find out how to get there. Let's find out what's in it." It's like, okay, well, they're all in on this. And I took my other wheels and I threw them in the garbage can because this is what they want to play. And what do you know? They had a wonderful time because they got to play exactly what they wanted to play, which was Secret Caves, the role-playing game. And so when you do these kind of multiple simple plots wheeling together, that then gives you enormous flexibility as a GM to highlight certain things that the players are interested in, to discard certain things that they're not interested in. And if they really seem to be gravitating towards the complexity, then you just double down on all the wheels and make sure that events in each one impact all the other events and make things really chaotic. Again, they're not hard to prepare because really all you're doing is preparing 3 very simple premises. And then you go to town and let the players do what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. I think that is something that sadly took me a long time to learn as a game master or dungeon master. But yeah, once you see your players kind of eyes light up, you mentioned secret caves under the manor, and their eyes light up, well, just go with that, right? Just lean into what they're doing. But I was thinking about the wedding here. I'm thinking about somebody who's running a campaign, right now, and they need a situation. How do they really get their characters involved in the situation? Say, what if we're doing the classic kind of roving band of adventurer who are just moving from kind of kingdom to kingdom? How do they become involved in this wedding? Does somebody ask them for help, or are they just snooping around? They're doing something else while they're here. What is it? How did they get involved to make sure that the noble duke or whatever marries the right girl?
So let's say that they are a roving band of adventurers, but let's also say that they are important and respectable enough to be invited to the wedding, right? Okay. Like nobody's going to shed any tears if the roving band of adventurers is a no-show, but Oh, they are the dudes who killed the evil dragon Parsthunus. Like, it would be rude not to invite them. So you want to have them have a reason to be there. If you can't do that, right? If your group is just too disreputable, cool, they're hired on as security. Done, right? They are presumably good at violence. That is the most important thing you need for your security dudes. So if they are security dudes, then it is clear that there is some sort of funny business going on. And if the funny business gets out of hand, that might impact their paychecks. I generally, though, don't like motivating players through their paychecks. It absolutely, it varies group to group. Know your players, know what they enjoy. But I historically have not had very many players for whom the accumulation of wealth was particularly motivating. So, I've had players who would say like, yeah, fine. It's something my character would be concerned with. I'll go along with it, but I'm not going to be enthusiastic about it. All right. So instead, what I would recommend is, tie the NPCs in this messy wedding, to the players, to the PCs, indirectly if necessary, right? So you probably can't say like, hey, remember that brother that you wrote about in your backstory? Like, surprise, this is him. That, maybe you can pull that off, maybe you can't. Know your group. But what you can do is, hey, this guy's your cousin. Right? You never said in your backstory whether your parents had siblings. They do. This guy's your cousin. Or, hey, remember that guy that you owe a favor to because he really helped you out 2 adventures ago? He sends you a letter and says, I need you to care about what's going on here. This particular NPC is a protege of mine. This particular NPC owes me money. You're probably not going to be able to tie any of these NPCs directly to a PC, but you can certainly find a way to tie each one of them to an NPC that the PCs care about.
Yeah, no, I agree. I like all of those kind of different options. I think you can really have a lot of fun there because there is, so many different ways to go with that. So I think that is really good. I think this, works really well in, a fantasy setting, and especially because, if you look at, I don't know, if you look at some of, I'll say older literature, but not like ancient literature. But if you look at older literature, right, there's always kind of something with a mistaken identity. There's a swapped baby at birth. Well, I guess it happens in ancient literature too. But like the sibling is off somewhere, unbeknownst to the other one. There's that. Those are kind of common elements and some stories, thinking of like the Prisoner of Zenda or different things, like people who look exactly alike and all kinds of stuff like that. And I just think, that some of those ideas, we might say, those are tropes or cliches or something. But I think some of those different ideas, like this one here, can be very compelling, and it pulls people, it can pull people right into a story. And, it's not necessarily, like you were saying, like 3 simple plots. It's not like some big intricate plot by itself or something like that. It's just some simple plots and see where the players kind of react and respond to some different ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Simple and honestly, I'm kind of chafing against. I realize I used the word plot, but now I'm kind of regretting using the word plot because to me, a plot is like, okay, well, A happens and then it leads to B and then leads to C. You don't want to prepare that. That's not fun. Yeah. Then you're just guiding your players through the nose. And then if your players are anything like me, it's like, dude, like, just write it up as a novel and then give me your novel and I will read it and let's save each other some trouble. Instead, what you want to do is not prep plots, but you want to prep situations. You want to prep powder kegs. And then if you can prep 3 very simple powder kegs, and figure out how they interrelate to one another, then you're off to the races. And then you're going to have so much more fun as a GM. Like, forget the players for a minute, right? Like, sure, they're going to have more fun. Who cares? You're going to have so much more fun because you're not going to be frustrated because you prepped all this material that now you don't get to use. And it's just like, well, why did I spend 3 evenings preparing all this material if it's not going to come up? Blah. Why did I even prepare these plots? No, just prep situations, prep some possibilities for how they might impact one another, and then let things unfold as they will.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I too, my advice is always not to prepare the plot because you never know what somebody's going to do, right? And so, absolutely. You shouldn't have been using that word because this is what I tell people all the time as well, is that we need a situation. And then we need the players and the characters to react to that situation. And then that's going to be part of the plot, right? When they react to it. In a novel, I'm writing a novel. I present a situation. I know how my main character is going to respond to that. But allowing the players really agency is definitely hit them with a number of situations, see how they react to it, and then the plot is going to form as they keep making actions and, driving the action forward, because that's what the protagonist of the story does anyway, right?
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, if you're playing some other setting, I think this could work in a number of settings. Probably not a modern setting too well, but science fiction, I think it works totally fine. And also, if you're playing Dune, this is just like some, the Bene Gesserit trick or something, right? They're trying to switch the babies or switch the brides or something. It just writes itself if you're playing Dune. So
absolutely,
there it goes. All right. Well, Tristan, this has been awesome. As always, having you back on. Why don't you just explain to the listeners out there what you were up to and where they can learn more about you?
So, hi, I'm Tristan Zimmerman. You might know me from the Molten Sulfur blog, where every Tuesday I put out a blog post pulled from real history or folklore, and show you, something really cool that's worth learning about in its own right, and then how to file the serial numbers off of it and drop it into your ongoing campaign, the one you're already running. I also am the author of the Emmy award-winning role-playing game Shanty Hunters, a game about collecting magical sea shanties in the year 1880. It's super fun and you should check it out. And I am currently hard at work, albeit slowly, on a sequel to Shanty Hunters called Ballad Hunters, where you are collecting magical folk ballads in England and Scotland in the early 1800s. So stay tuned for more on that.
All right, nice. And as always, anybody who's listening right now can head over to dicegeeks.com, hit the show notes for this episode, and you will find links to the Molten Sulfur blog and to Shanty Hunters and possibly something else that Tristan is doing, depending on my whims of what I link to.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Tristan, thank you so much just for coming on again. It is always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I delight to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, there you have it, guys. Oh, my goodness. Tristan always brings a wealth of knowledge for our games, doesn't he? Please be sure to check out his blog at moltensulfur.com. It is filled with tons and tons of articles that will help you add interesting situations to your games. Also, be sure to check out his role-playing games. Again, as always, links in the show notes. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. If you want to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. You can also leave a rating, review it, or subscribe to it in whatever podcast player you're listening to. Those things help the show immensely. All right, guys, I thank you so much for listening. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming!